Hi and welcome to my introduction video on NGRX Store, a reactive state management library for Angular. You can see this article, which is effectively an article version of this video, over at developer.school. You'll also see that inside of the comments and description. So as you can see, the first step is to, of course, make sure you have the Angular CLI installed. And then, of course, we're going to create a new Angular app using that Angular CLI. So let's jump over to the terminal and run these commands. So firstly, we want to run ng new, and we're going to call this ngrx shopping list. You can call this whatever you want, essentially, providing that you have the Angular CLI installed. It's just going to make a new Angular app. So we don't want to add routing at this point because we don't need it. We may have it in the future, but for now, we'll simply say no. And then we want SCSS. Once again, this is a trivial sort of decision because we don't necessarily need to have crazy styling at this point. So when we come to actually add NGRX Store in a moment, there's a couple of ways in which we can do that. We can do that with the Angular CLI, or we can just install NGRX Store just by default with npm. We're going to be using the npm option at this point, and that's just going to make sure that we do everything by the book, so we know how to go from an application that doesn't have NGRX Store, and we can see step by step how to actually add it to our project. And then in the future, I'll show you how to add this with the Angular CLI. So this may take some time to install, it'll be a good time to get some coffee or simply just sit back and relax as npm installs all of our packages. This would also be a great time to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to stay updated for more content, especially if you're interested in Angular and NGRX. So once that has completed, we can cd into ngrx shopping list, and then we'll need to install at ngrx/store. Now that's simply just installing the package itself. However, if we wanted to have the Angular CLI set this up automatically for us, we could run ng add ngrx/store. And by using the Angular CLI to do this, what this does is it updates package.json, it runs npm install on the ngrx store, it creates a reducers folder with the reducer, and as well as that it updates the app module.ts. These are all things that we're going to be doing manually for the first time. Then in the future, you can use this command to have this set up automatically for you. So now that we've installed ngrx store, and of course we've started our project, we can use code dot to open it up inside of VS Code, and we can run ngserve at the same time, and this will open it up inside of the browser. So what I've done here, I've opened up the application, I put it on the right, and our code is here on the left. The first thing I'm going to do is open up the file system, and inside of the source app folder, I'm going to make a new folder called store. And because our application is quite small, we're going to put all the things related to the store inside of this store folder. Now, if you have a larger app, maybe you're using something like NX workspaces to create multiple libraries, this makes sense on a library basis. It may not make sense on a larger app, which has multiple store elements. You may want to put that inside of its own sort of feature folder, but for now, it'll work for us. So let's make a store, and then inside of the store folder, we want a models folder, and that will be our shopping item.model.ts. So with the first thing in mind, we'll export an interface named shopping item, and our shopping list is simply just going to have an ID of string and a name of string. Super simple. You can think of this model at this moment as a representation of the shopping item inside of our store. So we'll have an array of shopping items, and each shopping item will have an ID and a name. Okay, so let's now move on to our store and make an actions folder. Inside of the actions folder, we can have a shopping.actions.ts file. And in ngrx store, actions sort of represent the main building blocks that express the unique events occurring throughout our Angular application. So what exactly does that mean? Well, we can think of an action as any time we want to update the state of the application or otherwise communicate with our store, we want to send off a particular action. So maybe if we wanted to add something to the shopping list, we would dispatch an action called add item. This will make sense in a moment. So let's import from NGRX store, and we want the action. We also want our shopping item, so let's import that too from our models. And then we can create a new enumeration. So let's export an enum called the shopping action types. Inside of our enum, we'll make an add item, and that will be equal to shopping add item. So this is a string representation of our action. Action strings have to be unique. So what we're doing here at this point is we're saying shopping in these brackets, and that allows us to say this action is part of the shopping state. And then we want to add an item. As this is a local synchronous thing, we're going to make the assumption that adding an item cannot fail. So it's always going to be successful. If we wanted to have a failure state and a success state, we might have an add item, but we also may have an add item success and an add item failure. And as such, we'd create a couple more different actions. That would allow us to start the add item process, and then if it was to succeed, we'd say, hey, this has succeeded, fire this new action, and so on. But that's sort of jumping ahead of ourselves for now. That's when we start getting into NGRX effects, and we will look at this in the future. For now, we just want the add item. We also want to export a class, and that class is called add item action. So this actually implements the action interface that we imported earlier on, and every action has two main properties, a type and an optional payload. So the type is read-only, and that's a read-only string, and that represents the type of action that we're going to dispatch into the store. So that will be shopping action types dot add item. And we also have the opportunity at this point to add an optional payload, and that's some data that goes alongside this action. In this circumstance, we can have a constructor with a public payload equal to the type of shopping item. And whenever we dispatch this action, we can pass along a payload of a shopping item. Finally, I'm going to export a type, and this type is going to be a shopping action, and that's going to say that that's either an add item action, and in the future when we have multiple actions, we'll say that a shopping action can either be an add item action, or maybe in the future we'll have a delete item action, and so on. For now, we're simply just going to set this equal to the add item action. So think about it this way. At the moment, now we've described the add item option or action for our shopping list app. We've described the fact that a user can add an item, and when they add an item, that's of type shopping item. So that's all well and good, and that gives us the ability to describe the action. But now we want to add in what's known as a reducer, and this reducer takes part in managing the transition from state X to state Y. So this takes our shopping items, so an array of shopping items, and if we added a new item, it would append the new shopping item to the end of the list. It would return this as a new array, so we aren't mutating state at this point, and we're going to look at that in the next section. So that means we now need a new folder called reducers. Let's create a shopping reducer.ts. So the first thing I want to do at this moment is define some initial state of our shopping item. So let's have a const initial state, and I'm just going to copy paste it in from the developer school article. And you can paste that in here, and you can see we now have an initial state which has an ID and a name of Diet Coke. This would represent one item inside of the array. And then next, what we want to do is export a function called shopping reducer. So the reducer has two things. It has the current state, and it also has the action. So the state will be of type array shopping item, and we can make our own interface for this if we wanted to, but for now we'll just set that to be the initial state. And finally we also want the action, and that's going to be of type shopping action. So we'll need to import that from our actions/shopping.actions. So the reducer says, hey, what's our current state? And at the moment we are giving it that initial state. And then it says, what's the current action that's being fired? And then we then have to do a switch statement on the action.type. And in the case of default, so this is where no action matches a particular shopping action, we want to return the state. So at the moment that's just going to return the initial state. However, if we have a shopping action types.addItem, then we want to return all of the previous state, but this time add the action.payload to the end of that. So what exactly is happening here? Well, we're returning a new version of our state. Note that we aren't overwriting the previous state. Instead, this is a new version that takes the previous state and then adds the new item. The item, of course, is that action.payload. And if we hover over the action.payload, we can see that an add item action.payload is of course of type shopping item because we typed that inside of the actions. So we can see public payload is of course the shopping item. Next up, let's add another thing to our models. And this time we can add something called app-state.model.ts. So like I said, we have a small app right now, so this sort of structure makes sense. And the app state is just going to be a sort of statically typed, a sort of strict typed interface for our state. So we can export an interface called app state, and we want to read only shopping, which is an array of course, a shopping item. So why are we doing this at this point? Well, that just allows us to get an idea of how our state looks throughout our application. So when we start to add other things to states, we can understand that, hey, we've got shopping, we might also have a cart, we might have multiple other things, but if we didn't keep this in an app state, it would be much harder to understand the structure and outline of our state. Okay, so next up, we want to go to our app module, make sure we save this, and then app-module.ts. And inside of that module, we want to import the store module.forRoot. And the store module comes from ngrx/store. You can also hit Command period, and that will give you the opportunity to, of course, auto-complete that. And inside of here, we have the option to pass in some reducers. So because this shopping functionality isn't part of a feature module at this point, we are going to say that this shopping is a root reducer, but if we had things such as shopping as a feature module, we'd want to use something called store module.forFeature inside of that module and then pass the reducer within that module. We'll look at this in future videos and articles, of course, but for now, we'll simply want to say that shopping should be equal to the shopping reducer. So we'll need to import that from, of course, our store reducers shopping.reducer. Now you can make an index.ts file to make this easier to import, but for now, as we have a small app, we can simply just import it in the long form version. We also want to add the forms module, as we'll be using the ng model. So let's take an import from @angular/forms, and we want the forms module. And here comes the fun part. So now we're going to look at wiring up the store to our user interface and seeing our shopping list in action. So to start with, I'm going to head over to the app component.scss and I'm going to paste in some CSS. This is nothing too complex. It's going to break how our application looks right now, but you can get this CSS over at developer.school, the sort of post that I've linked to inside of the description and comments, or you can just simply leave it, it's up to you. I'm then going to take the background color and put that in the styles.scss and save the file. Once again, this is part of the article. So inside of our app component, we want to make a constructor, and the constructor, of course, we'll be injecting our store of type store, which has our app state, and that represents our store. And the store itself comes from ngrx/store. So this tells ngrx how our store looks, and we'll see how we can select an item from the store in a moment. I want to keep the selection as part of ng on a net. So let's import on a net, and we'll implement the interface like that. We can remove the title. It's going to break our app component.html, but that's fine. And inside of ng on a net, I want to say this .store.select. And right now, if we say store and we put the arrow function and see the value of store, we can see that we have this shopping. And shopping then allows us to, of course, select the shopping item, or rather list of shopping items, because it's an array. And we get that because we've typed this to our app state. So ngrx knows how the store looks. And as a result, we get this typing, which makes our life much easier. So most of the time we won't be selecting items from our store like this. We'll be creating what's known as a selector. But for now, this will work because it's just a super small example. And the final thing I'd like to do at this point is to make a shopping items and set that to an observable. And that observable will be of type array shopping item. So we'll need to import observable from RxJS, and of course import our shopping item and set the value of our shopping items equal to that store selection. Once again, to make this quicker, I'm going to import from developer school the HTML, and that should allow us to, of course, display those shopping items on screen. So let's make this a little bigger, like so. And now we can see the shopping list. So we're using the async pipe to automatically subscribe to this observable. And if at this point you're thinking, how on earth has this Diet Coke appeared on screen? I don't really understand how this works. Well, let's just take a quick look back. So right now we have this add item and this add item action, which currently hasn't been used, so don't worry about that. Instead, we're inside of this shopping reducer, and we've decided to say, hey, this initial state contains this Diet Coke, and I can even change this to be something different. Let's change this to be Fanta and hit the save button. And then we can see we have Fanta. We can also add another item to the initial state. Give this a different ID. And this time say Diet Coke. And then we should have both items here on screen. So this is because we have this shopping reducer, which takes in the state equal to the initial state. And because we haven't given any action at all, it's just returned us this state. So the next thing to do is, of course, add a new shopping item. That's the fun part. So back over to our app component then, and inside of here, we want to add a new function, and that's called add item. An add item is going to dispatch an action to the store. So we can say this .store.dispatch. And as you can see here, this takes an action. We'll say new add item action. So we'll need to import that from our shopping actions. And then as we know, our add item action expects one payload. And that payload is of course a shopping item. So let's for now say ID of 123 and the name of Dr. Pepper. And inside of ng on a net, we can then maybe use a set timeout just to see this here on screen. We'll make that callback after 2 seconds. So what's going to happen is the shopping list is going to have 2 items, then it's going to add this new item after 2 seconds. So let's watch this. Fanta, Diet Coke, and then Dr. Pepper. So what has happened here? Okay, so we've added and dispatched this new add item action with the payload of this new shopping item. This has been passed down. Of course, firstly, we have this action class, which describes our item. Our reducer has picked up this action. It's matched this switch case equal to the shopping action types.addItem. It's then returned us the previous state, which is the Fanta and Diet Coke, but this time with the action payload. Not bad, but now I wanted the ability to, of course, change this up and add an item from the UI. Let's look at how we can do that. So what we want to do is add a new shopping item. That's going to be of type shopping item, and we'll give it some initial ID and name. And then Angular comes by default with a dependency on UUID, so we can import UUID without needing to install it inside of our project. And then inside of our add item, we can say this dot new shopping item dot ID is equal to the UUID. We can then dispatch the new shopping item itself, like so. And then after the item has been added, we can set this back to being a ID of blank and name of blank. So that's the add item functionality. Of course, it doesn't actually have a name, so it won't appear inside of the shopping list. We instead need to add this inside of our UI. Once again, I'm going to copy this from developer school, and we are going to add this underneath our div. All it is simply a form like this, which has a text, an ng model, a placeholder, and of course the form name. When somebody hits the plus button or the enter, it calls the add item function, and that function dispatches the action to the store, and so on. So inside of our app component, we can remove that set timeout now because we have the UI to add that to the list. Then let's add a new item, such as Dr. Pepper. Hit enter, and we can see Dr. Pepper inside of the shopping list. Once again, when we hit that plus button, we're firing this add item action that has the payload of the new shopping item. Inside of our reducer, it's then seeing this action. It's saying, is this an action type of shopping action types.addAction? If it is, of course it adds that to the end of our state and returns a new version. Then inside of our app component, because we're subscribed to this slice of state inside of our shopping items here, it updates our DOM with the new items. This shopping items observable array then has, instead of 2 items, it now has 3. So I have a challenge for you at this point. If you've been watching so far and you truly are trying to learn NGRX Store, go ahead now and try and add the ability to remove an item by ID. So we have everything we need at this point. We'd need a new shopping action to represent that deleted item. We'd also need a new reducer statement or reducer case to represent the deleted item, and the ability to click on an item inside of the list item here, or however you want to implement that. So if you can go ahead and try and implement that, that would be great. If you don't want to, that's fine. Just simply continue watching the video and I'll show you the answer to this. So let's start inside our shopping items. We'll have a delete item equal to shopping delete item. And we'll export a new class called delete item action, and that will implement action. The read-only type for this will be equal to the shopping action types.delete item. We then have a constructor which has a public payload of string. So our payload at this point is going to be the ID, of course, and that's going to be of type string. Final thing we want to do is update our shopping action and say that that can either be an add action or it can be a delete item action. That's everything we need to do for our shopping actions. Let's move now to our shopping reducer. So we have a case of shopping action types.delete item. We want to return a state.filter that filters our state. We'll check each item to see whether the item ID matches the action's payload, and that's going to allow us to remove the item if we don't actually want that inside of the list. Now that we've done that, we can head over to appcomponent.ts, and underneath our add item, we can have a delete item. That's going to have an ID of string. We can use the this.store.dispatch. We can dispatch a new delete item action. We can pass through the ID as a payload. Finally, inside of our app component, we want to add a click event to the li, which will say delete item, and we'll pass in the shopping.id. So once we say delete item shopping.id, that's going to be the ID of whatever we select. And when we select an item, it should remove from the list. Not too bad, we now have a pretty fancy addition and deletion shopping list. What's next? Well, wouldn't it be great if we could see and visualize our state changes without needing to build out this UI? Sure, each time we added something inside of here, we could also say console.log adding item, or maybe even just log out the action type, like so. And that would work because we would be able to see that we've added an item. And we can even see this in action by adding it to both things. And then inside of our console, if we click something, we can see we have shopping, delete item once more. We could also add the action.payload on both accounts. So then when we hit Fanta, we can see that we deleted this item ID, same with the Diet Coke, etc. So that's alright, but it could be much better. So what we can actually do here is take advantage of the Redux extension. So we can see the Redux extension here that I have for Chrome, and you can find this, once again I've got a couple of links over at the Developer School article for Chrome, Firefox, or whatever else you use. Once again, if you just check out the article, you'll be able to find a link for that. But let's look at how we can add this to our application, because although we have the Redux sort of DevTools extension, it doesn't work out of the box with NGRX. So once again, Angular gives us the ability to automatically add this, and because it's just such an easy addition, it might be easier to use the Angular CLI and then look at how this has achieved that, rather than do it manually like we did with NGRX store. So let's run ng add NGRX store devtools. This is going to go ahead and run npm install, as you can see right now. It's then going to update our app.module.ts, as well as update our package.json. And already you can see that my Redux DevTools is updated with new functionality. But before we look at that, I want to go over to, of course, the app.module.ts. And you can see that it's done this thing here, store devtools module.instrument, max age 25, essentially we want 25 state changes. And we can see here that was importing the store devtools module from ngrx store-devtools. So if you want to add this yourself, you can either run the npm install, or you can just use the ng add. So let's look at this. Right now we have an inspector, and that inspector says that the ngrx store was initialized. We have this state, and we have the action. For now, let's have a look at the state, and on the tree, we can see we have two items inside of our shopping item. The first one is Fanta, the second one is Diet Coke. If we add an item, let's add Dr. Pepper, and then hit enter, we can see the inspector said shopping add item. And if we select that, we can see we now have the third item here, Fanta, Diet Coke, and then we have Dr. Pepper, which has a new ID. We can look at the action as well as the action payload. And we can also look at the difference between the states. So the diff is of course this new item here. And we can even now delete an item. We can see that's been deleted. And if we delete everything, it gives us the ability to step back in time. So if we click this arrow, we can see that we are stepping back in time if the state changes within our application. We can also go all the way to the back and hit play, and this will play through all of the different actions. So the Redux and NGRX store DevTools is definitely worth adding to your NGRX applications. I hope you can find and hope you can see just how important it sort of is to an application that uses NGRX. It gives us the ability to dive into our state, to look at our actions, and you can imagine that debugging an application is so much easier than console logging everything inside of a reducer, or even creating what's known as a meta reducer to log everything, etc. But the store devtool modules gives us the ability to go backwards and forwards and much more. So in summary, we looked at how to add NGRX store to a new project. We made a small shopping list application here. We looked at how to, of course, add different actions, how to create a reducer, as well as looking at the NGRX store devtools to investigate each item as it was added or deleted from the list. So NGRX itself is quite large in understanding the different concepts of how everything works. We haven't looked at the router store yet, we haven't looked at effects and much more, but this should get you on your feet in looking at sort of synchronous things that aren't looking at HTTP servers or anything like that, just data that of course is synchronous to the client. If you'd like to see more NGRX content, let me know inside of the comments section below. If you don't want to see NGRX, but you want to see something else, of course, let me know what you think. Thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to check out the article version of this video and much more over at developer.school. I'd also really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button to stay updated with more videos that I create. Thanks a lot.